Hello, welcome to Wetpixel Live. I'd like to introduce my fellow presenter, Alex Mustard. Hi, Alex.
Hey, Adam. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. One of our topic for discussion today is one of the most discussed topics on the Wetpixel forums, and that is really about what the best choice is for SLR cameras underwater. And broadly speaking, one of the biggest things that we need to decide on is the sensor format we're going to use. And so people tend to refer to what are known as full frame sensors or cropped sensors. Now, full frame sensors are a sensor that has a 35mm size. And it
I've got a good example here, Adam.
Okay, there we go. There we are.
Yeah, it's an old box of slide film.
There we are.
So you can see the picture. It's a dolphin silhouette.
Oh, wow. On film. There you go.
Shot in 98, wow. 99.
There you go. Very nice. So the full frame sensor refers to the size of a piece of film, i.e. 35mm. So the sensor has a 35mm side to it. Crop sensor refers to sensors primarily that are smaller than that. And there are lots of different crop factors, which is not really worth going into. But broadly speaking, Canon and Nikon SLRs, you're roughly speaking a crop factor of 1.5. So you're looking at about a 25mm sensor. So effectively, the sensor on the crop sensor camera will be smaller than that on the full frame sensor. Now, this has a bunch of effects that affect the camera in terms of the way it performs, in terms of the way it performs in specific conditions, in terms of the lenses that are available for it, for a whole bunch of other issues. And that's really what Alex and I want to discuss today. So we should point out that in terms of this, we don't really want to say that one is better than the other, but what we want to do is give you some guidance on the differences and what we would probably choose in an ideal world as an underwater camera. So, Alex, what do you think? Let's start. Maybe let's talk
full
about
frame
lenses.
SLR. You got it.
Let's talk about lenses. Let's talk about the difference between lenses on full frame versus crop sensor cameras.
Okay, I think the first thing I would say is that, first of all, I don't want to take sides on this. I think actually, we can't really argue this out, because I think both of us are in fairly good agreement that if you had to recommend one camera to be the best underwater camera, I think both of us would currently say that the Nikon D500, a crop sensor SLR, is probably the best all-round underwater camera. However, I think people can get too het up about these things, and there are plenty of people who enjoy shooting in both formats, and both of us do as well. So, and I think the other thing to say at the beginning is, when you're a photographer using these systems, you don't really notice the difference. Once you've bought the camera and you put your lens on it, it looks exactly the same using a crop sensor SLR as a full frame SLR. I actually, on a night dive when we were running the last Lembe workshop, I borrowed a friend's D500 for the night dive, and his housing is the same brand of housing as mine, but it's a completely different color. But because it's a night dive, I, for most of the dive, forgot I'd borrowed his camera. And it's just a housing that looked completely different, because all the buttons were in the same place. But in the dark, I didn't notice. It was, didn't notice the color. And I didn't even notice I was using a D500. I just looked through it. That was my view. And I shot my pictures. The focus modes were the same. So I think people make a big fuss about the differences, and they're relatively small. However, I do think, because it's a question that comes up again and again, it is worth digging into those. And I think the question you asked me about lenses is really probably the most important. And the reason that we feel that if you had to choose one, I would go crop, is because the lens choices available for a crop sensor SLR, particularly a Nikon or Canon one, are so well suited to underwater photography. And they're particularly those main lenses of a really good macro lens and a really good super wide angle lens, that work so well, that make it work really well underwater. So it's the availability of a Tokina 1017, which is just the perfect wide angle zoom, and a 60mm or 50mm macro lens, again, which is just such a good workhorse lens for so many subjects, that make those systems so strong, particularly with the type of diving that a lot of people like to do. I think the other factor that comes into that choice is that the Tokina 1017, being a fisheye zoom, works really well behind a small dome port. Small dome ports are cheaper and easier to travel with. They allow you to get you closer to the subject. A full frame camera needs a bigger dome port, which is more expensive, to realize the additional quality of that system.
Yeah.
Now, of course, you can take a picture on a full frame camera behind a small dome port, but you're really going to struggle with corner sharpness. You're going to throw away a lot of the image quality of the system that you've invested in.
Yeah.
So it's not really a sensible thing to do. So as a result, I think the lenses that really are available for crop sensor cameras, and the fact that you can use them behind the wide angles behind smaller dome ports, make it a really nice system. So although the camera and housing are often not much smaller,
No,
the
same size,
D850 and the D500 are pretty much the same size camera.
Yeah.
Actually, the rig often of a crop sensor ends up smaller because of that smaller dome port, certainly for wide angle shooting.
Yeah. I think one of the things that obviously we were going to touch on full frame resolution in a minute, and that's important because with a full frame camera, the trend, and it's an ongoing trend, is that the resolution is significantly greater than that on crop sensor cameras, and certainly whilst generally resolution is a good thing, underwater we shoot through water. That's the first problem, and the water has stuff in it. And so when we have very high resolution cameras, it tends to pick up that stuff more than the lower resolution. So that's the first problem. The second problem is, of course, that optically, when we have flaws in our optical system, the higher resolution tends to show us those flaws. So it's harder to get away with less perfect optical solutions with a full frame high resolution sensor than it is with a less resolution. Now that's not really a difference in terms of the size of the sensor itself. It's more to do with the fact that as the sensor gets bigger, you tend to have more resolution. Against that, of course, though, as we increase the resolution, we also increase the quality of the image. So, and I know, Alex, you mentioned on one of the previous episodes that you switched to the D850 primarily in order to future-proof your image library for publication in the future. So,
I think first of all, I'd like to pick up on that. The point about it's really a way how you look at the problem. The point you made about higher resolution sensors reveal more of the flaws in your image optics.
Yeah.
And yes, it's truthful, but I also think that a high resolution camera will get more out of a cheap lens. But if you don't, but you'll see also the failings of that lens more easily.
Yeah.
So I do think if you put the same cheap lens on a very high resolution camera, you'll get a better image quality than if you use that cheap lens on a less high resolution camera.
Yeah.
But you'll also see the flaws of it more, and so it's worth bearing that in mind.
Yeah.
I think in terms of image quality, there's no doubt that there is an advantage in full frame cameras, but I think you have to ask yourself very carefully as a photographer, do you really need it?
Yeah.
Because the reality is, if you shoot for magazines, they can only put 18 megapixels on the page, and both crop sensor and full frame cameras easily out-resolve that these days. I think it's also important to note that across the board, full frame cameras don't necessarily have more resolution than crop sensor cameras.
No. Yeah.
There's a lot of the crop sensor cameras have 20 to 24 megapixels now, and a lot of the full frame cameras are 20 to 24 megapixels. There are a few exceptions of much higher resolution ones.
Yeah.
So it's not an either or.
Yeah.
And actually, I think some of the best full frame cameras are those ones in that 20 to 24 megapixel range, which is just such a really nice file size. There's very few applications you really need a higher resolution than that. The question you asked me was why I choose to use a camera that's a higher resolution than that. It's partly because the Nikon D850 is a very sweet camera.
It is, yeah.
It's got very nice blend of features. It's a nice form size. It's got, really good autofocus, really good frame rate. It's got everything you kind of need. Plus, it's got this really high resolution. And for me, I'm slightly concerned as a photographer who sells a lot of images, that if cameras continue to go up and up and up in resolution, that in the future, you might have a situation where clients say, how come you're only giving me a 20 megapixel file? All these other photographers are giving me a 50 megapixel file.
Yeah.
And what I don't want is in 20 years' time, pictures I took now at 20 megapixels seem dated, not because of the quality of the image, but because the client is so used to 50 megapixel files.
Yeah.
And that's the only real reason that I feel I want to shoot a D850 is that sort of future proofing.
Yeah.
I think. Oh, sorry.
I know that Alex and I probably don't really belong to the school of thought, but also, of course, one of the advantages of resolution is it does give you extra editing headroom as well. So, you can crop in on images more, you can reshape your image. So, certainly, I think both Alex and I are people that like to get it primarily right in camera. But that option is more readily available in a high resolution sensor as well.
Yeah, and I'm not, it's yeah. I think the problem in underwater photography though is if you're not getting as close as you possibly can, you're probably not getting the maximum out of the opportunity.
Yeah.
So cropping is less capable than that. I think an area of underwater photography though that actually surprisingly likes full frame cameras are some of the competition photographers.
Yeah.
And what they like about that is they have to produce a picture, particularly on the day, the photo sub style competition. They have to produce a picture straight out of the camera that looks really good.
Yeah.
And they actually like the fact that they can change the crop mode during a dive. So they can dive with a 60mm macro lens, shoot a big subject, fill the frame with it, find a small subject, switch to a crop sensor mode, and still be able to fill the frame with it using the same camera. Yeah. And, okay, one picture is a 50 megapixel file and one's a 20 megapixel file, but it doesn't matter in the competition because the competition's rules say you can't have cropped the picture. Yeah. And they weren't cropping the picture in camera. They were simply, they changed the crop factor on the sensor. So that's something that appeals to people with the full frame cameras. And in fact, quite a lot of them actually shoot their wide angle with their full frame camera in crop mode so that they can use the 10-17 and have that flexibility because they're not really interested in realizing the full image quality from the camera. They're just trying to produce a perfect JPEG for a competition type shot. The area I think we absolutely have to talk about is high ISO and image quality in low light. And there's no doubt that the bigger the sensor you have, the bigger the pixels or the photo sites on that sensor is, the greater signal to noise ratio you will get from the sensor. In the early days of digital photography, that made a huge difference to the end image quality. But to be honest, the witchcraft that the camera manufacturers have put on their sensors now
and
is
software.
so amazing that, ultimately, you can just turn these cameras up to higher and higher ISOs and the image quality holds together. And I have to say that there's almost no picture that I would be scared of taking on a D500, say, in terms of ISO, because the image quality just holds and holds and holds. And the same is true with my D850. I just turn the ISO up. And although I have a D5, which is a real low light monster, actually the underwater world rarely gets dark enough to really see its advantages. So I think the cameras have progressed to a point, and particularly the Nikons that I'm more familiar with, that you can just pretty much, the ISO question has gone out the window. There's another factor in ISO that is specific to underwater photography that people often don't think about. And that is to get the best corner-to-corner image quality with a wide-angle lens behind a dome port, you need to shut the aperture down. And on a full-frame camera, you need to shut the aperture down considerably more than a crop sensor camera. And so although the full-frame camera has better high ISO noise, when you're shooting in those dark environments, you actually need to keep the camera aperture more closed, and you basically throw away that stop and a half of advantage that maybe the full-frame camera does have over a crop sensor camera because of that need to shut the aperture more. So the reality is that I think a D500 and a D850 have pretty much the same high ISO capabilities. And they're also good now that I don't think it's a point really. I think if we had this conversation 5 years ago, we'd be going full frame all the way, full frame all the way. But now it has really changed. And 10 years ago, you wouldn't have even had the conversation. It was just like, if you want that high ISO capability, you need a 5D or you need a D3 or whatever it is. It was back then. Now it's, the crop sensors do amazing things.
I think if my only camera, if my only subject for the next 10 years was going to be big wide-angle scenics, then I probably would change my mind and say that's an ideal place to shoot with a super high resolution full frame. But I think the point here is that in general terms, for all-round use, we both agree that the crop sensor is still the better format.
I think I have to finish by being honest and then saying that I don't use a D500, and as I mentioned earlier in this, that is really because I want that absolute ultimate image quality. But I think the factor that really tipped me over to stopping using my crop sensor cameras was when I invested in water contact optics. And with when we did my gear review, I showed you some of them with the Zeiss corrector, with the 13mm RS, with the WACPs. I've got really good wide angle optics that have removed that allows me to shoot a more open aperture and still keep my image quality. And therefore I benefit from the high resolution of the camera. I benefit from the high ISO noise because I'm not having to give it away with the aperture.
Yeah.
So I really get a lot back from my full frame cameras in that respect.
Yeah.
So that for me is one of the main reasons why I like using the full frame cameras. But I have to say, if someone turned around to me and said, Alex, you've got to shoot a D500 for the next 3 years, and I would be completely content with it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I shoot both, and I do use a D500 typically out of preference, but as you say, there are some circumstances, in particular towards contact optics, that I switch back to switch to the D850. So, yeah. Fantastic. I think that's a very useful discussion. Thank you very much, Alex. Where can we see some examples of the D850 in action and compare them to mine?
Well, the best place to really sort of interrogate my pictures is on my website, which is amustard.com. And on there, I have a searchable library of images. And you can search that library both on species, on locations, on colors, or whatever you want. But you can also search it on camera specs. And so if you type in D850, you'll see all my D850 pictures. It's a little bit, if you type D500, you'll see D500 pictures. They're mainly taken with your camera, actually. I don't know if I borrowed it. But so that's a really good way of seeing my pictures. But if you are interested in the cameras, you can have a good look at them that way. I think it's quite an interesting way to go to look through them.
And I think in general, that's probably, it's a good thing to look at different people's images and with the cameras and see what people can achieve with respect to cameras when you're making these types of decisions, because that's a good way of looking at it. Thanks very much, Alex. We'll say goodbye now. And thank you to you all for watching. I'd like to thank our sponsor, which again is CCAM, for this episode. Please feel free to subscribe to the channel, to add comments. We hope this topic will engender some discussion, so feel free to add it to the comments, and to like it if you've enjoyed the content. Thank you very much.